everyone, and welcome to the second of the online Hersch Lauterpacht Memorial Lectures of 2021 with Professor Susan Marks. We heard yesterday a brilliant opening lecture, drawing out the many meanings we make of dignity. Professor Marks made us think of dignity as a social practice, a lived experience, as holding plural and contradictory resonances, and as historically, contextually, and politically specific. She showed us that it is, as she puts it, a worldly concept. And soundings from Twitter, email, and WhatsApp make clear at least two things. Our shared pleasure in Lecture 1, and that we have been collectively holding our breaths for the next installment. And so I will hand over to Professor Marks in short order, but just before I do, a reminder that the third and concluding lecture will be tomorrow at 6 p.m. And then there will be a Q&A session with Professor Marks on Friday at 1 p.m. We hope you will join us for both. And now, without further ado, the screen is yours, Professor Marks.
Thank you so much, Surabi. I'm just going to share my screen again and see if I can show you some slides. Okay, I think that's hopefully worked. Great. So as Surabi recalled in my last lecture, I laid stress on the experiential and embodied character of dignity, the point that it's not just an idea. However, it is also an idea, and in this lecture, we look at the tradition of thought associated with it. The English word dignity is traced to the Old French dignité and modern French dignité, and through them to the Latin dignitas, dignitatem in its accusative form, meaning merit or worth, and dignus, meaning worthy. Discussions of dignity often draw a distinction between two kinds of dignity, corresponding to two forms of merit, worth or worthiness. On the one hand, there's the inherent worth and value of every human being, and the respect that is due to all of us simply by virtue of our being human. We might call that intrinsic dignity. On the other hand, there is the honor that belongs and the esteem that is owed to those who hold high office or occupy some other particular status or role. A number of now obsolete meanings of dignity were along those lines. It once denoted an honorable office, rank, or title, or by transference, a person holding a high office or position, or even by further transference, the whole collectivity of persons of high estate or rank. But while those meanings have lost currency, the idea remains recognizable in the inflected term dignitary. Let us call that second kind of dignity status dignity. The common thread is obviously that dignity refers to the condition of being worthy of respect, honor, or esteem. A related sense identifies it with conduct befitting the condition of being worthy of respect, honor, or esteem. If someone comports themselves with dignity or lends things around them an aura of dignity, they bring to their situation that distinctive composure and decorousness to which we attach the label dignified. Yet there is an important distinction to be registered here. For while intrinsic dignity is an egalitarian idea about universal human worth, status dignity is rooted in hierarchy, privilege, and rank. This is reflected in a bifurcation of the conduct befitting sense of dignity, as Daniel Miller observes. In an ethnographic study of life on a London street, Miller contrasts the dignity of, as he puts it, an aristocratic demeanor, which is inherited, may put others in awe, and seems to come from effortless success, with the modest and pleasant dignity that is, in his words, as respectful of others as it commands respect, and that abides and is retained even in the midst of failure and however undignified the circumstances. The philosophical literature on dignity mostly converges around an historical narrative which is said to underlie the distinction between what I have termed intrinsic dignity and status dignity. It is through the history of ideas related in this narrative that our modern concept of human dignity is said to have taken shape. I will recount the story in this lecture, but just to indicate its broad outlines, it begins in classical antiquity, then moves to the Italian Renaissance philosopher Pico della Mirandola, and from him to the sage of 18th century Königsberg, Immanuel Kant, held by many scholars to be the towering figure in the evolution of the idea of human dignity. A subsequent unfinished chapter takes up the 20th century invocation of human dignity in constitutional laws and, as I noted in my previous lecture, human rights instruments, along with the large and ever-growing body of national and international jurisprudence and academic commentary that has accompanied that invocation. This is a story with which anyone interested in the topic of dignity needs a basic familiarity, even if, perhaps especially if, it turns out to tell us only part of what we need to know about the history of dignity. Ancient Roman dignitas is discussed by Giorgio Agamben in his typically erudite meditation on the testimonies of Holocaust survivors and the fate of dignity in bare life, remnants of Auschwitz. One reads there that the Latin term dignitas was a juridical term related to the sphere of public law. It signified, Agamben tells us, the rank and authority that inhere in public offices, as well as, by extension, those offices themselves. So there was dignitas equestre, dignitas regia, dignitas imperatoria. Agamben refers to the codification of Roman law prepared for the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and in particular to Book 12 of the text we call Justinian's Code, entitled De Dignitatibus. This sets out the powers, duties, privileges, and immunities of a huge range of dignities: consuls, judges, praetorian prefects, generals of the cavalry and infantry, chamberlains, quaestors, decurions, notaries, imperial secretaries, and all the myriad other officials of eminent rank in Justinian's Byzantine government. Book 12 also indicates the order of precedence of these dignities, and it deals with the question of eligibility for access to them. A general section at the beginning states in one notable provision that the entrance to or gate of dignity, porta dignitatis, is barred to those of bad reputation, whose infamy and iniquity exclude them from the society of respectable people. In another provision of that section, the code declares, "Let no one who belongs to the lowest class of merchants, brokers, or persons engaged in vile or abject pursuits or employments, or who occupy base or dishonorable positions, attempt to enjoy any dignity." Agamben writes that it was only later that dignity came to be separated from office holding and, as he puts it, interiorized. A dignified person then became, as Agamben explains, a person who, while lacking a public dignity, that is to say, an office of the appropriate kind, behaves in all manners as if he possessed one. Fundamentally, then, in Agamben's words, dignity became something autonomous with respect to the existence of its bearer. End of quote. Something the entrance to which was in principle barred to no one. It seems that a certain interiorization may already have been anticipated in Roman Republican times by the statesman, jurist, and writer Marcus Tullius Cicero. In his treatise on public ethics, De Officiis, composed in 44 BCE, Cicero mostly refers to dignity in the classical public law sense. But he also gives some intimation of an idea of dignity as an element in that which sets human beings apart from other living creatures. He writes that whereas animals are impelled by instinct and the gratification of sensuous desires, human beings have a superiority and dignity, excellentia et dignitas, which consists in the fact that, in his words, the human mind is nurtured by study and rational contemplation. That said, it is evident from the context that Cicero's main concern here was to put forward a Stoic-inspired argument about the evils of intemperateness. His message is that a life which does not exhibit the virtue of moderation and keep impulses under the control of reason is unworthy of the dignity of humankind. Let us therefore turn to another writer who has been considered more important as an antecedent to modern thinking about human dignity, the 15th century Italian Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Pico's text, known as Oratio de Hominis Dignitate, is not, I think, the most renowned artifact of the Italian Renaissance, but it has some celebrity in writings about human dignity. It was written in 1486 as the introduction to a much longer work in which Pico set out some 900 philosophical theses or conclusiones. A conference had been organized to debate these theses the following year in Rome, and Pico would need to deliver an oration introducing his arguments to the learned participants. In the event, the oration was never delivered. Pope Innocent VIII cancelled the conference and ordered a theological inquiry into Pico's theses, which eventually saw their condemnation. There exist copies of the introduction because it was published by Pico's nephew, Gianfrancesco, 2 years after his death, as well as in many subsequent editions and translations from the original Latin. Left untitled by Pico, it was styled Oratio de Hominis Dignitate, Oration on the Dignity of Man in the conventional English rendering, in an edition that appeared in Strasbourg in 1504. Despite the name that it was given, the oration contains few references to dignity, and it is strikingly obscure, mixing Christian themes with natural magic and Jewish mysticism. Brian Copenhaver has recently argued that it actually has nothing to do with dignity. In his words, Pico never wrote an oration about human dignity. Instead, he drafted a speech to promote ascetic mysticism, a way of life incompatible with human dignity, as modern thinkers have used the word dignity in English and other vernaculars. If other scholars have felt able to make sense of the oration's posthumous title, they emphasize what they take to be Pico's investment in the distinctively self-creating, self-choosing character of human beings. For John Milbank, Pico carries forward in admittedly unorthodox terms the Church Fathers' conception of humanity as a proteus, whose specificity lies in our capacity to choose among and combine together, now quoting from Milbank, the ruling, knowing, and loving functions of the three angelic orders of the thrones, cherubim and seraphim, but whose real dignity is our capacity to elect to be united in the love of the cherubim to God. Indeed, in one of its rare usages of the word dignitas, the oration declares, Let us fly off to the otherworldly court that is near to the most eminent divinity. There, according to the sacred mysteries, seraphim, cherubim, and thrones occupy the first places. Let us emulate their dignity and glory, unwilling as we are to yield to them and unable to endure second place. As Milbank reads Pico, he is signaling that human dignity, now quoting again from Milbank, lies finally in the divinely gracious gift, the act of grace that grants us the capacity to emulate the angels, share in their glory, and be close to God. Such an account plainly interiorizes dignity. One is no longer in the outer domain, so to speak, of authority and office. Yet it still remains at some distance from a notion of intrinsic dignity, inasmuch as the implication is not that we, as Milbank says, possess dignity in ourselves or thanks to any inalienable property. Rather, as Milbank puts it, dignity is something that we are granted, that we have borrowed, or might indeed copy. Stephen Riley argues that the oration provides a point of departure for modern conceptions of human dignity because it anticipates later secularized approaches to self-constitution and self-command. Maybe so, but the work of Milbank, Copenhaver, and others suggests that properly intrinsic dignity was the outcome of later developments, including 3 centuries after Pico, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In a study of the history and meaning of dignity, Michael Rosen expresses the widely held view that Kant's contribution is in fact of overriding importance. Kant should stand at the center of any historical account of dignity, Rosen writes, as his thought has been the inspiration of very much of what has come later. One thing that has come later is the international protection of human rights, to which I will turn in a few moments. But in passing, it's worth noting that Rosen also, and relatedly, says that it is on Kant's, now quoting, giant shoulders that the modern theory of human rights largely rests. The main text to which attention is directed in this context is the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, first published in 1785. It is well known, I think, that this is the work in which Kant identifies his famous categorical imperative, the general ethical principle that he states with the formula, act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. In the discussion of the universal law of nature that follows, Kant also states his famous principle of humanity, the specific practical imperative that commands, so act that you use humanity in your own person, as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. For as Kant explains, a human being, and generally every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means for the discretionary use of this or that will. Kant links the principle of humanity to a distinction between absolute worth and conditional or relative worth, and between persons and things. All objects of inclinations have conditional worth only, he writes, since if the inclinations and the needs founded on them did not exist, their object would be without worth. At the same time, beings whose existence rests not on our will, but on nature, if they are non-rational beings, have only relative worth as means and are therefore called things. In contrast, he writes, rational beings are called persons because their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves, i.e., something that may not be used as a means. That persons have absolute worth is further clarified in terms that bring us eventually to the concept of dignity. After laying out his idea of persons as self-legislators in a kingdom of ends, Kant writes, "In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. What has a price can be replaced with something else as its equivalent, whereas what is elevated above any price and hence allows of no equivalent has a dignity." He continues, "What refers to general human inclinations and needs has a market price. What even without presupposing a need conforms with a certain taste has a fancy price." I think he means an aesthetic value. "But what constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself does not have merely a relative worth, i.e. a price, but an inner worth, i.e. dignity." So what is it that constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself? What is it that has dignity? Kant says that morality is the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in itself, as it is possible only by this to be a legislating member in the kingdom of ends. It follows for him that morality and humanity, insofar as it and only it is capable of morality, is that which alone has dignity. Morality and humanity, insofar as it and only it is capable of morality, is that which alone has dignity. I need to mention just one more step in his chain of reasoning here. If Kant emphasizes the idea of persons as legislating members in the kingdom of ends, that is because he wants to bring out another specific practical imperative, the principle of autonomy. This invites us to regard, now quoting from Kant, the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will, and hence to think of human beings as not simply subject to morality, the moral law in his phrase, but as free agents who are themselves authors of it. Addressees, in other words, who are also originators. Returning to dignity, Kant adds that the universal, but notably self-enacted legislation that determines all worth must itself have a dignity. Autonomy, he writes, is thus the ground of the dignity of a human and of every rational creature. The word which Kant used that from the beginning got translated into English as dignity was Würde. Würde is related etymologically to Wert, meaning worth, value, or price. And like others of and after his time, Kant saw this latter concept as carrying a salient ambiguity. On the one hand, there was worth in the sense of exchange value, the value of something that is fungible, that has an equivalent, that can be replaced by something else. On the other hand, there was the value of that which has no equivalent, which is irreplaceable, and which accordingly does not have merely relative worth, worth as a commodity or object of exchange, but absolute worth, or as he also characterized it, inner worth. That irreplaceable, incommensurable, incomparable worth was what Kant associated with dignity, a kind of value that, as he puts it in another passage of the groundwork, stands infinitely above any price with which it cannot be balanced or compared at all without, as it were, violating its sanctity. As we have seen, he presented this dignity that stands infinitely above any price as a property of morality and of humanity. And where humanity is concerned, he pointed to an essential connection between it and autonomy, the freedom and agency of human beings manifested in his account in their self-legislating, self-binding role with respect to moral duties. The sections from the groundwork to which I have just referred are those foregrounded in discussions of Kant's contribution to the conceptual history of dignity. But it is commonly observed that he also used the word in other ways, or at any rate in contexts that seem to suggest other readings, both in the groundwork and elsewhere. Olafur Sensen argues that when Kant says that the human being is above any price, and that that which is elevated above any price has dignity, he is in fact adhering to the classical frame of reference and communicating that dignity is superiority in the sense of uplift to a loftier domain, a more exalted form of value. Michael Rosen acknowledges that this corresponds to part of Kant's use of the term dignity, but only a very minor part, he says. Overall, and like most other authors, Rosen holds that Kant departs from the tradition in which dignity is a matter of elevated status. Kant's conception of dignity is deeply egalitarian, Rosen writes. For the major point to be taken from Kant's work is that dignity, again quoting from Rosen, is an intrinsic quality of all human beings, something that all human beings have in common. And so it is, we read that, again quoting from Rosen, under the influence of Kant, it has come to be taken for granted that dignity and equality go together, just as Kant played a significant role in establishing the terminological link between dignity and autonomy. To speak of the influence and role of Kant is, of course, to look back to Kant from the standpoint of later times. Which later times? I have been narrating this story about status dignity and intrinsic dignity and about the evolution of human dignity as though it were the accretion of centuries. In actuality, it is itself a 20th and 21st century story. The edition of Pico's oration that I've been using reports that the work was rediscovered only in the 1930s and 40s. The explosion of Kant's scholarship, and at any rate Kant's scholarship on dignity, is a more recent development still. And if one sets store by Google Ngram, a search of the phrase human dignity shows that it similarly started to become significant within Ngram's corpus of English language books in the later 1930s and 40s, with sharp rises in significance occurring during the 1950s and 60s and at intervals thereafter. To provide a true representation of this story, I should have begun in the 20th century when discussions of human dignity brought with them the question of the history and antecedents of human dignity and worked backwards. Let me belatedly then move on now to take up the narrative as it has unfolded closer to our own time. The main focus here will be on the uptake of dignity in national constitutional and international human rights discourses. References to dignity, by which I mean, of course, its equivalent in the relevant language, can be found in a number of pre-World War II constitutions. But there is uncertainty as to what was intended by those references, and most authors consider the legal enunciation of human dignity a post-war phenomenon. Dignity is evoked in very many post-war constitutions, more than 160 apparently, of which the German Basic Law and the Constitution of South Africa have been among the most influential in this respect. In the sphere of international human rights, I already quoted in my previous lecture some pertinent passages from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Equally, the concept of dignity features in many of the human rights treaties that followed the adoption of the Universal Declaration. For example, the opening preambular paragraphs of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966 repeat the Universal Declaration's assertion that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, peace, and justice in the world. And it also affirms, as you see there, the states parties' belief that these rights, the rights recognized in the two covenants, derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. Central to the later 20th and 21st century visibility of dignity in this sense of intrinsic dignity is the very large jurisprudence that is built up out of interpretations of dignity by national and international courts and tribunals, including where the particular text makes no explicit reference to dignity, but such reference has been treated as implicit. To this jurisprudence must also be added the very substantial body of legal scholarship, doctrinal and theoretical, that has in turn built up out of it. In a trailblazing survey of judicial interpretations of dignity published in 2008, Christopher McCrudden reviews cases about topics that include censorship, abortion, peep shows, sadomasochistic sex, so-called dwarf throwing, unwanted life-saving treatments, fertility treatments, and assisted suicide. What was human dignity taken to mean in these cases, he asks, and is there a common conception of human dignity that emerges, either in particular jurisdictions or transnationally? McCrudden considers that while the various judicial interpretations do not enable the identification of a common conception of human dignity, they are consistent with an idea of human dignity which has a certain basic minimum content. He proposes that this basic minimum content, this minimum core, has at least the following three elements: a claim that every human being possesses an intrinsic worth merely by virtue of being human, a claim that this intrinsic worth should be recognized and respected by others, and a claim that recognizing the intrinsic worth of the individual requires that the state should be seen to exist for the sake of the individual human being, and not vice versa. If beyond that minimum core, there exists, in his view, in his account, no coherent judicially interpreted conception of human dignity, either within jurisdictions or across them, what significance does dignity have in constitutional and human rights adjudication? McCrudden argues that rather than providing substantive meaning, a key role of dignity in this sphere is institutional. In ways that he describes, it helps courts and tribunals to explain the resolution of conflicts of rights, and it also reinforces the capacity of courts and tribunals to take into account local contexts and contingencies. McCrudden is more recently the editor of a very substantial collection of essays entitled Understanding Human Dignity. With contributions from legal scholars, moral philosophers, theologians, and historians of ideas, the book returns to the issue of a minimum core meaning of human dignity and addresses a range of further and related questions. What is the foundation of human dignity? Should a person's dignity be assessed subjectively with reference to his or her own views, or objectively? How does the dignity of human beings relate to the dignity of nations and of institutions like parliaments? Do animals and other non-humans have dignity? A particular focus of many of the essays is on the relationship between human dignity and human rights. Are the international human rights covenants correct to say that human rights derive from human dignity? Is human dignity itself a right? Does reference to dignity strengthen the protection of human rights, or instead constrain and reduce it? Can dignity be waived? For a number of the contributors to McCrudden's book, human rights not only do not derive from human dignity, but for better or worse, are at odds with human dignity. And while a variety of different reasons are given for that, one is that human dignity is on their account, dignity is on their account, inseparable from ancient and medieval dignitas. In another important intervention in this debate, Jeremy Waldron takes up the question of what the hierarchical conception of dignity as rank, dignitas, or status dignity, as I termed it, means for the modern egalitarian conception of human dignity. Waldron is entirely committed to the modern egalitarian conception, but he argues that analysis of it, in his words, should strive to keep faith somehow with dignity's ancient connection to noble rank or high office. To his mind, it is not the case that, again quoting, the old connection of dignity and rank was simply superseded by a notion of the dignity of humanity as such, and that this latter notion is really quite different in character. Rather, as he writes, the resources of the older notion are put to work in the new one. Specifically, Waldron holds that the connotation of ranking status remained, and what happened was that it was transvalued. In his words, the high status of the few became the high status of everyone. In other words, a universal elevation. In Waldron's abundantly quoted formulation, the modern notion of human dignity involves an upwards equalization of rank, so that we now try to accord to every human being something of the dignity, rank, and expectation of respect that was formerly accorded to nobility. Excuse me for a second. An argument with a somewhat similar drift has been advanced by Jürgen Habermas. Reflecting on human dignity and what he terms the realistic utopia of human rights, Habermas notes the seemingly, in his words, paradoxical generalization of a concept of dignity that was originally geared not to any equal distribution of dignity, but to status differences. How are we to understand this, he asks. On the one hand, now quoting again, status-dependent dignities which occur in the plural coalesce into the universal dignity of human beings, and this new abstract dignity sheds the particular characteristics associated with social honor. On the other hand, this new abstract dignity continues to involve, he writes, a self-respect that depends on social recognition. As he further elucidates, the concept of human dignity transfers the content of a morality of equal respect for everyone to the status order of citizens who derive their self-respect from the fact that they are recognized by all other citizens as subjects of equal actionable rights. Habermas makes explicit that what he is talking about here is an imbrication of human dignity, human rights, and democracy. Human dignity carries forward the element of status recognition, only now the relevant social status is democratic citizenship. And democratic citizens protect their human dignity by, in his words, establishing and maintaining a political order based on human rights. Dignity is likewise a theme in the work of other leading philosophers of law, rights, and justice. and it is perhaps a measure of the concept's rising prominence over recent decades that a series of related neologisms have come into use. Thus, we here talk of dignitarian jurisprudence and dignitarian theory, of dignitarianism and of dignity rights. The words dignitarian and dignitarianism are so new that they don't even appear in the online Oxford English Dictionary, unless I've missed something. To give just a couple of examples, Pablo Gilabert outlines a dignitarian approach to human rights, identifying the approach with a program of normative dignitarianism, according to which, in his words, at least some of the central norms concerning the treatment of individual entities depend on their inherent dignity. Gilabert links such an approach and such a program to the larger project of putting humanity first. On the subject of dignity rights, Erin Daly examines the meaning of dignity as a right under diverse systems of constitutional law. Rather than evincing a singular right to dignity, she finds that the cases point to many dignity rights, encompassing a spectrum of interests to do with, as she puts it, the part of each person that is individual and that entitles one to set one's own life course. In the final analysis, Daly's assessment is that courts choose to invoke human dignity in order to say something about what people are entitled to purely by virtue of being human. Humanity and agency, respect and self-respect, autonomy and recognition. These are the leitmotifs of philosophical and legal engagement with dignity. No less recurrent across the literature is this narrative arc that takes us from status dignities to intrinsic dignity, and that in doing so almost invariably gives particular prominence to Immanuel Kant, whether or not detailed consideration is provided of the scope and limits of his contribution to the human dignity concept. Given the centrality of Kant in this story, I want to use my remaining time in this lecture to expand a little on the arguments I've rehearsed in connection with him. I will mostly be referring to texts other than those on which I have touched so far. But as a start, let us return for a moment to the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Kant's idea of a metaphysics of morals is, of course, the idea of a pure moral philosophy, a moral philosophy that detaches itself from the sphere of empirical knowledge and relies entirely on a priori reasoning. He writes, all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason. And he explains that seeing as moral laws are to hold for every rational being as such, it is necessary to derive them from the universal concept of the rational being as such. It is necessary completely to set forth all moral science, which for its application to human beings needs anthropology, a branch of knowledge Kant dubs in the same text the empirical part of ethics, first independently as pure philosophy, i.e. metaphysics. Kant is emphatic that an adequate explication of issues that include, as we have seen, human dignity has to be, in his phrase, completely isolated. And except when it comes to the application of the moral law, again, to use his words, mixed with no anthropology. These references to anthropology are interesting because Kant was among the pioneers of that field. He taught a course on anthropology at the University of Königsberg annually from the 1772 to 73 academic year until his retirement in 1796. His Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, published in 1798, is said to have had the largest first print run of any of his works. Well before all of this, he taught anthropology as part of a similarly pioneering course on geography. Kant began teaching geography in the 1756 to 57 academic year. And after introducing his standalone course on anthropology, he alternated between the two lecture series, normally offering geography in the summer semester and anthropology in the winter semester. While he never produced a book on geography like his anthropology text, he wrote a number of essays linked to his lectures, and also arranged for the publication of an edited version of the lectures, which appeared in 1802 under the title Physical Geography. The contents of his courses in geography and anthropology are also known from surviving notes taken by students and auditors and other materials. Framed as issues of aesthetics, topics he covered are additionally addressed in his Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, published in 1764. Is there anything in these various writings which is relevant to, or at any rate, worth bringing to bear upon, a discussion of human dignity? To read the philosophical and legal literature on dignity, one would assume that there is not, as it makes no mention of them. However, investigations into Kant's anthropological and geographical thought and into previously understudied aspects of Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime may prompt us to wonder about that. It is hardly surprising that Kant's notions of anthropology and geography were different from our notions of them today. As he presents the two areas of study, they form a twofold field that is concerned with nature and the human being. I call the first instruction, nature, physical geography. The second one, the human being, I call anthropology, he writes in an essay announcing the courses in 1775. On the other hand, since the human being is part of nature, Kant's geography was also concerned with human beings. An 18th century spatial trope may suggest that, according to his way of thinking, geography had to do with the outer or external nature of human beings, their physical characteristics, or to use a later term, ecological situation, and anthropology to do with inner or internal aspects, the psychological and moral life of human beings. But there is uncertainty about that distinction, and in any event, Kant goes on to say that what is important is that both fields must be considered cosmologically. That is, in his words, with respect to the relation as a whole in which they stand and in which everyone takes his place. How is this consideration, this inquiry to proceed? One of the more famous biographical facts about Kant is that he never left Prussia, and indeed almost never left his native city of Königsberg. By all accounts, he was, however, a voracious reader of travel literature. And as an inhabitant of a bustling Baltic seaport, he was also well placed to pick up the stories of sailors, merchants, missionaries, explorers, and adventurers, which in his time were a prime source of information in Europe about distant lands. Thomas McCarthy observes that Kant repeatedly warned his students about the unreliability of sources of that kind. But as McCarthy puts it, rely on them Kant did, recycling in the process the racist commonplaces of the age. Thus, to give just a couple of examples, we read in Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime that the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the ridiculous. and that the difference between Negroes and white people seems to be just as great with regard to the capacities of mind as it is with respect to color. In a later essay, the Native Americans are put before us as a race which is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, and incapable of any culture, though there is enough of it as example and encouragement nearby. A race which ranks still far below even the Negro, who stands on the lowest of all the other steps that we have named as differences of the races. Yet Kant's contribution to sustaining racial hierarchies was by no means simply a matter of recycling racist commonplaces. It was also, to speak again with McCarthy, a matter of naturalizing these commonplaces by biologizing them. For Kant was an early and highly influential theorist of race, one of the central figures in the birth of modern scientific racism. More than that, the argument has been widely made that it is he who should be regarded as the inventor of the concept of race, in the sense of being the one who, and now quoting from one scholar who makes this argument, who gave the concept sufficient definition for subsequent users to believe that they were addressing something the scientific status of which could at least be debated. The one who secured the concept's status and influence, initiating the idea that the concept of race should be put on a scientific footing, and producing the first theory of race worthy of the name. Kant's thinking about race was informed by the classificatory work of Carl Linnaeus and the Comte de Buffon, as well as by the writings of the younger Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, whose work Kant in turn informed. Kant's thinking about race also developed in response to criticisms by his student, Johann Gottfried Herder, and by Georg Forster, who accompanied James Cook on the latter's second voyage to the South Pacific in 1772 to 75. In his early discussions of human variety, Kant dwells mostly on differences of temperament, understood along the lines of the medieval theory of humors. His turn to racial theorizing seems to have been, at least in part, an effort to defend the idea of monogenesis, the idea that, as depicted in the creation story, humanity has a single origin, against the polygeneticist multiple origin claims that had been advanced by Voltaire, Lord Keynes, and others. I have referred to the essay which Kant wrote in 1775, announcing his lectures in the coming academic year on physical geography and anthropology. The title under which that announcement was published is On the Different Races of Human Beings. It has been pointed out that in Kant's time, a specific word for race, Rasse, had only relatively recently entered the German language and was initially used mostly in relation to animal breeding. That is helpful to know because the propagation of animal species is his starting point in this essay. Kant writes that just as there exist distinct species of animals, so too, now quoting, all human beings on the wide earth belong to one and the same natural species. And just as animal species exhibit variations of diverse kinds, including variations that, again quoting, persistently preserve themselves in all transplantings over prolonged generations, which are called races, the same applies, he writes, to human beings. The bulk of the essay is then devoted to examining the causes and consequences of the division of the human species into different races. Kant writes that there are 4 races distinguished here and throughout his subsequent writing by reference to skin colors, which he identifies as white, red, black, and yellow. His explanation for how these races arose goes something like this. As it was the destiny of human beings to people the whole earth, they had to be made suitable in potentia for living in all climates and every soil. To enable this, they were implanted with a set of seeds. The word he used was chyme singular, chyme plural, sometimes translated as germs. Each of these seeds contained different natural characteristics. The word he used was Anlagen, sometimes translated as dispositions. In different climatic conditions, the seeds appropriate to that particular climate became activated, according to his account. And with that, the natural characteristics corresponding to those seeds developed. These processes happened at some point in the remote past, and they were permanent. Even where further migration occurred, the activation of one set of seeds blocked the further activation of another set of seeds. The four races are a reflection of the fixed natural characteristics that were the result. And Kant presents the races as standing with respect to one another in a rank order of perfectibility, to use his word. That is to say, as the passages I quoted a moment ago illustrate, a rank order of capacities and prospects. In one notorious passage, he raises the question of why the inhabitants of Tahiti exist at all. In another text, he expresses a belief that all except the white race will eventually be extinguished. Although, as for example just then, Kant refers to one of the races as white, he always portrays whites as not just superior, but, to borrow a formulation from Mark Larimore, qualitatively different, distinguished from the other races as balance is from imbalance. It is Larimore's argument that in inventing race, Kant also invented whiteness as an escape from race, the summation and circumvention of race, a race that is simultaneously beyond race. Thus, Larimore observes that those attending Kant's lectures learned that they were well prepared to make the world their home. Prepared for transplantation anywhere, they must and could make something of themselves. End of quote. Kant's own words On the Different Races of Human Beings certainly suggest this. He tells his prospective students that the instruction he will provide in geography and anthropology will give them knowledge of the world, in his phrase, a kind of knowledge that is the means by which all other knowledge becomes, again quoting, useful not merely for the school, but for life. Knowledge through which, again quoting, the accomplished apprentice is introduced to the stage of his destiny. And if this knowledge of the world is pragmatic and providential, it is also importantly scientific. The mere, again quoting from Kant, description of nature is far from sufficient to indicate the ground for the manifold variations that characterize humanity. What is necessary, what his theory of race supplies, he writes, is explanatory natural history. In his formulation, a history of nature, which is a separate science and which could gradually advance from opinions to insights. Of course, Kant's pseudoscience of race would take off in the succeeding century, even if his seed theory would be displaced by nowadays more familiar versions of social Darwinism. Rather later, when the history of human dignity fell to be written, we have seen that his work on the metaphysics of morals became significant in particular ways. As we have also seen, philosophers and legal scholars repeat and reenact Kant's own gesture of completely isolating his writing about dignity and construing it as mixed with no anthropology. They discuss his role in the emergence of a new abstract dignity, an intrinsic dignity that is realized in equal citizenship and counterposed to all heteronomy. They write of the transvaluation of status dignity and of the upwards equalization of rank in human dignity. Yet, if the person who should stand at the center of any historical account of dignity is also one of the people, perhaps even the person, who should stand at the center of any historical account of race, then there is surely at least a question as to what these two histories have to do with one another. Perhaps, as some contend, race science did not have to build bridges to the human sciences and philosophy, inasmuch as it was in large part constituted by them. Perhaps, as is again contended, Kant's ideas about morality, humanity, and with that dignity presupposed his anthropology and geography. For Larimore, to read Kant's ethics without reference to his profoundly and fatefully inegalitarian account of human diversity is to misread him. Larimore concludes, "We may not be able to uproot the ideology of race, which Kant helped legitimate, without tracing its connections to his metaphysics of morals and providing pragmatic as well as theoretical counter-knowledge." My next lecture will attempt to provide some relevant counter-knowledge through inquiry into an episode in the recent history of dignity. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I think I speak again for everyone when I say this is turning out to be this week and is an absolute feast of ideas and thoughts. And as I said yesterday, can't wait for tomorrow, 6 o'clock. So see you then. Good evening, everyone. Good night. Thank you, Susan.